core part of this unit is thinking about ethics in the context of business and ethical decision making. I really would like to point out that this is more focusing on how to think about ethics than more what your ethical position should be. Because in the end, that's something you need to think about. And I hope some of the tools that we actually talk about and develop here will help you think about ethics so that you can act in a way that is consistent with your values and the way that you would like to actually act. So without further ado, let's move on and think a little bit about ethics. So there's an old joke that talks about a dry cleaner who has a child, and the kid comes to the dry cleaner and says, "Hey, what's the meaning of ethics?" And the dry cleaner thinks there for a while and says, "Hey, well, imagine that a customer came in and they left $100 note in their jacket. Ethics is whether I tell my partner about that $100 or not." Okay, so it's a bad dad joke. But inside that joke are some ideas about ethics that are really useful to think about. First, ethics involves a reference point. Okay, so it's only a kind of joke, a bad joke, but it's a kind of joke because you're expecting you're expecting an ethical framework where you give the money to the customer. Whereas we come up with a different ethical framework that isn't keeping it, but it's not what we expect. So we have these different ways of thinking about ethics where people can actually think a certain behaviour or activity is actually ethical, and other people may think it's not. There are different views around ethics, and that's a lot of what this session is actually about, helping us think through why, what, and how can we look at these ethical approaches, and how can it help us to improve ethical decision making. Now, of course, ethics just doesn't apply to business, it applies to all parts of life. Everything from journalism to sport to entertainment, politics. So ethics is a very broad topic, but we are going to concentrate on it in a business setting. So what makes ethical issues so complex in a business environment? Well, I think it's all got to do with the relativity involved. The issues are complex for lots of reasons, but it's because we have this conflict. A conflict maybe between a goal we can achieve and the way that we've got to achieve that goal. So this causes a kind of pressure. The complexity is also made a lot harder for four key reasons. First, we often think of something as kind of ethical or not, when in fact, most of the time, behaviour is in a grey area, right? It's not this digital right or wrong, it's often analogue, a kind of grey thinking about the issue. The second kind of thing is if you've got an ethical dilemma, it's probably going to take you courage to actually act in an ethical way, or it's going to take even the organisation courage in the decision making to act in a particular way, because there is often pain, particularly short-term pain in the decision. That pain could be physical, but in a corporate sense, it might be the pain of lost money. So that creates a real kind of tension in terms of making these ethical decisions. The final point we have there, something that I hope we can spend a little bit of time discussing face to face, is the idea that often people change their behaviour for the circumstances that they're in. So corporate systems need to be really carefully thought about, because most people adapt their behaviour, what they'll do and not do, based on those corporate systems that they're actually in. One of the things that happens, though, is that it becomes really important to make sure that those systems back up ethical behaviour. There's a great quote from Warren Buffett that really makes this point. It's only when the tide goes out that you know who's wearing swimmers. And what he's really saying there is when things are going well, when you don't have a conflict, you're probably not going to have any behaviour or any ethical lapses. It's only when something goes wrong or when times are tough that the ethics becomes far more important in what we have to do. Okay, so that's an introduction to ethics. Next, we're going to deal with a framework for thinking about ethics before looking at ethics in an organisational context.